The rain drummed on the black umbrella I held awkwardly over my head. The drops dripped down my collar, but I hardly noticed the cold. I stood in the third row of mourners. Not the first. Dolores had made sure of that. My stepmother, all in black, with perfectly styled platinum hair under her veil, sobbed so loudly that the priest stammered twice. On either side of her stood her children, Wesley and Darla, my half-brother and sister. Their faces expressed a sorrow befitting the occasion, but I knew it was contrived. Jebediah Lawrence Oakley was a man of principles and hard work, the priest said. He built his business from the ground up and became an example to many. I almost didn't hear the words. My eyes were fixed on the coffin. Daddy? My dad. Until a week ago, we were on the phone and he was complaining about the weather and his back pain. It's nothing, Mercy. You know how these doctors like to dramatize things. His voice sounded cheerful as always. And now he was gone. A heart attack. Sudden and merciless. When the ceremony was over, people began to disperse. Dolores accepted condolences, occasionally putting a lace handkerchief to her eyes. I moved toward the casket to put down the white rose and say goodbye, but Wesley, as if by accident, blocked my way with his broad back. Please, I said quietly, I need to say goodbye to Dad. Wesley turned around, as if he'd just noticed me. Oh, Mercedes, I'm sorry, he said with a fake smile, but he didn't budge. At that moment, Dolores announced loudly that she was inviting everyone to a memorial dinner at Jebediah's house. The house where I grew up, but which had ceased to be my home 7 years ago when my father married Dolores Huxley. The crowd began to move toward the cemetery exit. I was pushed back, and when I tried to approach the coffin again, the workers had already begun to cover the grave with earth. Mercedes, are you coming? Leighton Farley, the longtime foreman at my father's company, asked me. He had a weathered face and kind eyes. I'm sorry about your father. He was a good man. Thank you, Leighton. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Yeah, I'm on my way. The house was full of people. Dad's former colleagues, business associates, neighbors. Dolores reigned in the living room, sitting on the couch, surrounded by sympathetic women. Wesley and Darla scurried between guests with glasses and plates. I felt like a ghost. No one paid any attention to me, except for a few of my father's old friends who came over to offer condolences. Your dad always spoke so proudly of you, Vincent Quinlan, a contractor Dad had worked with for years, told me. He was so happy when you became a nurse. My Mercy is always taking care of others, he said. I nodded, unable to utter a word. If you need anything, let me know, he added, squeezing my shoulder with his big hand. Thank you, Mr. Quinlan. I was making my way through the crowd toward the kitchen to pour myself some water when I heard Darla's loud voice. Of course, the house will stay with Mom. As for the company, I think the best thing to do would be to sell it. Wesley was already talking to potential buyers. She was standing in the corner of the dining room with a glass of wine in her hand, talking to some man in an expensive suit. I froze. Sell the company? I asked, stepping closer. But Dad never wanted to do that. He built it from the ground up. He always said it was his legacy. Darla turned to me with a look of polite surprise on her face, as if she'd spotted a cockroach on the wall. Mercedes, honey! Her voice oozed with fake sweetness. This isn't exactly a good time to discuss business, don't you think? We just buried your father. But you've just... Let me introduce you to Mr. Hudson, she interrupted. He's a partner in the law firm of Hudson and Price. Mr. Hudson, this is Mercedes, Jebediah's daughter from her first marriage. Mr. Hudson gave me a slight nod. My condolences, Ms. Oakley. Thank you, I replied automatically, but my gaze was fixed on Darla. I just want to say that Dad always planned on... Mercedes! Darla interrupted me again, sharper this time. This really isn't the time or place. Mom is very upset, and the last thing she needs right now is a discussion about the future of the company. We're all just trying to get through the day. I've stopped talking. My voice, already quiet, seemed to lodge somewhere in my throat. Darla took the moment to pull Mr. Hudson away, tossing him over her shoulder. Perhaps you could help in the kitchen. I think we're running low on appetizers. I was left standing, clutching my empty glass. This was my childhood home, but I felt like an uninvited guest. There were still pictures hanging on the walls of my dad and me smiling, happy and carefree, before Dolores showed up, before he had found happiness again, as he put it, introducing me to his new bride and her 2 children. "You're like a ghost at your own funeral," a quiet voice behind me made me flinch. I turned around and saw Pearl Nightingale, my father's former accountant. She was in her 70s, but her eyes were still as sharp as needles. "Ms. Nightingale," I tried to smile. "I didn't know you were here." "I came to pay my respects to your father," she said. "Jebediah was a good boss, and an equally good man." She looked around the room, and her thin lips pressed into a line. It was a shame it had to turn out this way. I wasn't sure what she meant, but before I could ask, Pearl patted my arm and stepped away. The whole evening dragged on awfully slow and heavy. Dolores was sobbing loudly, accepting condolences. Wesley was discussing some projects with his father's business associates, and Darla was whispering with her friends. No one noticed me standing at the window, looking out into the backyard where Dad had once built a swing set for me. When I finally decided to leave, Dolores intercepted me at the door. "Are you leaving already?" she asked, her voice sounding relieved, not disappointed. "Yeah, I have to work tomorrow," I said. "Early shift." "Sure, sure." She patted my arm with her cold fingers. "We'll be in touch about everything else. I'll tell Garrett to get in touch with you." Garrett Montgomery was the family lawyer. Last time I saw him was at my dad and Dolores's wedding. "About the will?" I asked. Dolores pressed her lips together. "And the other formalities. Don't worry, everything will be done right." I nodded and stepped out into the cool evening air. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy and gray as lead. My apartment was a 10-minute drive from my father's house, in a small complex on the outskirts of Rutland. When I walked in, the silence came over me like a wave. I threw off my soaked shoes, hung up my coat, and sat on the couch without turning on the light. Now I could cry. Without an audience, without Dolores, without her children. I cried for Daddy, for our broken family, for not even being able to say goodbye to him properly. I fell asleep on the couch, and in the morning, with a headache and puffy eyes, I went to work at Rutland Memorial Hospital. "Mercedes!" exclaimed Tracy, the head nurse on our unit, as I entered the residence room. "What are you doing here? You were supposed to take the day off." "I have to work," I said, pulling on my uniform. "I can't sit at home and think." Tracy shook her head, but didn't argue. She knew me well enough. The day went by in the usual hospital hustle and bustle. I checked vitals, changed IVs, talked to patients. Work had always been my sanctuary. It was where I knew what I was doing, where I was needed. "Hey, Oakley," Dr. Prescott called me after lunch. "Could you take 2 more patients? Gloria's late, and I have rounds." I'd already worked 12 hours straight, and my legs were buzzing with fatigue. "Of course, Dr. Prescott," I said, taking the cards from him. "Thanks, you're a real lifesaver," he said over his shoulder as he walked away. "You're too kind, Mercy," Tracy said to me as we ran into each other in the hallway. "Prescott's always taking advantage of your responsiveness. You have to say no sometimes." After my shift, I drove home in total darkness. October evenings come early in Rutland. I turned on the radio to drown out the silence, but turned it off when the DJ started making jokes about some celebrities. I wanted silence, but not solitude. It was a strange desire. At home, I checked my phone. No calls, no messages. Not from Dolores or Garrett Montgomery. It was as if my connection to my father's family had ended with the funeral. I opened the photo album. Here's me and my dad fishing when I was 10. Here's me getting my nursing degree, and Dad standing next to me, so proud I think he's about to burst with happiness. And here's the last Christmas we spent together, before he married Dolores. both of us in silly reindeer sweaters, laughing by the tree. After the wedding, everything changed. Dolores quickly made it clear that I was no longer the center of Jebediah Oakley's universe. He had a new family now. Sure, he called me. We sometimes had lunch together. He came to important events in my life. But there was a wall between us. A wall named Dolores. The next few days passed like a blur. Work, home, sleep, work again. I waited for a call from Garrett Montgomery, but the phone was silent. I could have called myself, but something stopped me. Maybe the fear of hearing that my father's will made no provision for me. Or worse, fear of confirming what I already suspected, that Dolores had completely cut me out of my father's life, even after his death. On Wednesday night, as I was returning from work, I got a call from Carol, a neighbor in the complex. "Mercedes," she said. "I just saw your name in the obituary section of the newspaper. Your father died? Why didn't you say anything?" "Yeah." I didn't know what to say. "Yeah, last Friday. The funeral was Monday." "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." She sounded genuinely sympathetic. "Are you okay? Do you need anything?" "I'm fine. Thank you, Carol. If you need company or help, just let me know. I can bring you dinner or something." "Thank you," I said again. "I'll be fine." After the call, I bought a newspaper. In the obituary section was a picture of my father and a short note about his life. Left behind his loving wife, Dolores, and her children, Wesley and Darla. My name was added at the end, almost as a belated thought, as well as a daughter from his first marriage, Mercedes. I crumpled the paper and threw it away. On Friday, exactly a week after my father's death, I received a phone call from Leighton Farley. "Mercedes?" His usually confident voice sounded hesitant. "Do you know about the meeting about the will?" "What meeting?" I asked, feeling my heart start to beat faster. "Today at 3 o'clock, in Garrett Montgomery's office. Dolores is gathering all the interested parties for the reading of the will." I looked at my watch. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I had time to drive. "Thank you, Leighton. I didn't know." "I thought you did," he said sadly. "Good luck, Mercy." Garrett Montgomery's office was in downtown Rutland, in an old brick building with columns. When I walked into the reception area, the receptionist looked up at me in surprise. "What can I do for you?" "I'm Mercedes Oakley," I said. "I'm here for a meeting about my father's will, Jebediah Oakley." She looked through some papers on the table. "I'm sorry, but your name isn't on the guest list." I swallowed. There must be a mistake. I'm Jebediah Oakley's daughter. "Just a moment." She stood up and disappeared behind the office door. A few minutes later, the door opened and Dolores appeared. Her face expressed fake surprise. "Mercedes? What are you doing here?" "I came for a meeting about Dad's will," I said, trying to make my voice sound confident. Dolores looked at me with a look of regret that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, honey, this meeting is only for those listed in the will." She said it loudly so that everyone in the waiting room could hear. I felt the color flood my face. Wesley and Darla came out of the office and stood behind their mother, their faces showing the same fake sympathy. "I'm his daughter," I said, and my voice trembled. "Of course I have to be at this meeting." "Garrett said only those mentioned in the will are invited," Dolores said, as if explaining to a child. "I'm just following protocol." I stood frozen, not knowing what to do next. Fight? Demand? That was out of character for me. Darla stepped forward and put her hand on my shoulder. "We'll call you if anything concerns you, okay?" she said with the same fake smile as her mother. I nodded silently, turned and walked out of the office, feeling the stares of everyone there. Humiliation was burning me from the inside out, but I didn't let it break through. Not here, not in front of them. It wasn't until I was in the car that I let myself slap my hands on the steering wheel in impotent rage. How could they? How could Dad let this happen? I started the car and pulled onto the road with no clear plan of where to go. I didn't feel like going home. I didn't want to go to work. I just drove through the streets of Rutland, the town where I'd been born and raised, the town that now seemed foreign to me. The next week after my father's funeral dragged on interminably. I plunged headfirst into work, taking extra shifts and coming home only to shower and sleep for a few hours. It was easier not to think, not to constantly remember Dolores's words. This meeting is only for those listed in the will. On Friday, I finally took the day off. I just couldn't take it anymore. Fatigue came over me like a heavy blanket, and I slept until 11 o'clock in the morning, which was almost unheard of for me. I was awakened by the phone ringing. "Hello?" I sleepily answered without looking at the screen. "Mercedes? It's Vinnie Quinlan. I'm sorry to bother you." I sat up on the bed, finally awake. "Vincent Quinlan, my father's old friend and business partner." "Mr. Quinlan, is everything all right?" Yeah, he's a little confused. You know about the meeting today?" "What meeting?" "At your father's office. Dolores called everyone in at 2 suburbs this afternoon. Something about the future of the company." I felt my insides clench. Again. Again, I wasn't invited. No, I didn't know. My voice sounded too flat, even for my own good. "That's what I thought," Quinlan sighed. "Look, Mercy, I think you should be there. It's your father's company. He built it from the ground up, and no matter what Dolores says, you have a say in it." "She made it clear I wasn't in the will," I said quietly. "And you believed her?" I could hear the surprise in his voice. "Jebediah couldn't." He paused. "It doesn't matter. Just show up. 2 o'clock. Maple Street office." He hung up before I could answer. I got up and went to the window. The day was gray and dank, a typical Rutland fall. In another life, I might have spent a day like this with a book and a cup of tea, enjoying a rare day off. But right now, my thoughts swirled around Quinlan's words. "And you believed her?" Had I really believed Dolores so easily? The man who had systematically forced me out of my father's life for 7 years? The woman who wouldn't even let me say goodbye to him at his funeral? "Pull yourself together, Mercy," I said to my reflection. "You're Jebediah Oakley's daughter. You have a right to be there." Oakley Construction's office was in a small 2-story building on Maple Street. Dad had bought it 15 years ago when his business began to expand. I remembered him proudly showing me around the new premises, telling me about his plans. "Someday this will all be yours, Mercy," he'd say. "Or at least parts of it, depending on which path you choose." I chose medicine, not construction. Maybe that's why he changed his mind. Maybe that's why he decided not to leave me anything. The parking lot in front of the office was full. I recognized a few cars: Leighton Farley's big pickup truck, Pearl Nightingale's old Ford, which I thought was long gone from the company. Dolores's black Mercedes was parked right outside the entrance as a symbol of her new status. I took a deep breath and got out of the car. It was now or never. Sitting in the reception area was an unfamiliar girl with bright red hair. She looked up when I entered, her gaze expressing mild surprise. "What can I do for you?" she asked with a professional smile. "I'm here for a meeting," I said. "I'm Mercedes Oakley." Her eyes widened even more. "Oh!" She clearly didn't know what to say. The meeting's already started. They're in the conference room." "Thank you." I knew where it was. I'd been here hundreds of times when I was younger. My dad would sometimes pick me up after school, and I'd do my homework in his office while he finished his work. The conference room was at the end of the hallway. The door was closed, but through a pane of glass I could see the people inside. Dolores sat at the head of the table, where Daddy usually sat. On either side of her were Wesley and Darla. Around the table were familiar faces: Leighton Farley, Vincent Quinlan, a few other contractors and employees, and Garrett Montgomery, the family lawyer, with a pile of papers in front of him. I knocked and entered without waiting for an answer. All heads turned in my direction. Irritation flashed across Dolores's face, which she quickly hid behind a mask of polite surprise. "Mercedes?" She said my name as if she couldn't believe her eyes. "What are you doing here?" "I came for a meeting," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and confident. "It's about my father's company, so I think I have a right to be here." Dolores exchanged glances with Wesley, who shrugged slightly. "Honey," she said in the tone one uses with a naughty child, This is a business meeting for company executives and legal representatives. I don't think I'm Jebediah Oakley's daughter, I interrupted her, raising my voice. I have a right to know what's going on with his company. Actually, Wesley interjected with a smug smile, legally, you don't have that right unless you're a shareholder or employee of the company, or an heir named in the will. And you're obviously neither, Darla added, with feigned sympathy. I felt the color flood my face. They were deliberately humiliating me in front of all these people, many of whom had known me since childhood. Jeb would never approve of his daughter being treated like that, Leighton Farley said suddenly. His weathered face was frowning. He would want Mercedes to know what was going on. Mr. Farley, Dolores said coldly, with all due respect, you cannot know what my husband would have wanted. But I, as his widow and executor of his last will, do. And what is that will? I asked. Have you made a will yet? Garrett Montgomery cleared his throat. Actually, Ms. Oakley, the formal reading of the will is scheduled for next week. This meeting is more about the day-to-day operational issues of the company. And since you have nothing to do with those matters, Dolores said with a fake smile, your presence here is unnecessary. I stood there, feeling the stares of everyone present. Part of me wanted to turn around and run away. But the other part, the part that had been silent for too long, demanded that I stay and fight. It's not fair, I said, and my voice shook. Dad wouldn't want me to be excluded from… Mercedes! Dolores interrupted me sharply. This is not up for discussion. This meeting is for those directly involved in the business only, and, for that matter, the will. She paused, looking me straight in the eye. The will was changed 3 months ago, dear. Your father, re-evaluated his priorities. Her words hit me like a slap in the face. 3 months ago? But that's when Dad was already on those powerful medications for his back pain. He was often distracted, forgetful. Did he really realize what he was doing when he changed his will? I wanted to ask that, but I realized I couldn't say a word. My throat constricted. My eyes began to sting. Not this. Not the tears. Not here. Not in front of them. I think you should leave, Darla said softly, rising. We'll contact you if the need arises. I took a deep breath, turned and walked out of the room, closing the door behind me. The hallway was quiet and empty. I leaned against the wall, trying to calm my breathing. Not to cry. Just don't cry. They were always good at making people feel small. Pearl Nightingale's voice made me wince. She was standing at the door of her old office, watching me with her sharp eyes. Ms. Nightingale, I straightened, trying to maintain my dignity. I didn't realize you still worked here. I don't, she snorted. I was asked to retire 2 months ago, after 35 years of service, but Garrett insisted I attend today. Something to do with the transfer of financial authority. She stepped closer, her heels clacking on the polished floor. Do you know what's going on, Mercedes? She asked quietly. In this company? Since those two came here? I shook my head. I didn't know much about my father's business in recent years. We've estranged. They isolated him, Pearl said, and her thin lips pressed into a line. First her, and then her offspring. Your father was a good man, Mercedes, honest, but a little naive when it came to the people he loved. What do you mean? I asked, feeling the anxiety building inside me. Pearl looked around, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. A year ago, when Wesley and Darla started helping at the company, I noticed some inconsistencies in the financials. Little things at first. Invoices that seemed overstated. Payments to vendors I didn't know. And then, she stopped talking as the door at the end of the corridor opened, and a secretary stepped out. Ms. Nightingale? She called out. Mrs. Oakley wondered if you could join them. Pearl nodded. Tell her I'll be right there, Trixie. As the girl disappeared behind the door, Pearl turned to me and said quickly, Come to my house tonight, 7 o'clock. There are things I'd like to tell you. She straightened up, pulled on her old-fashioned jacket, and walked toward the conference room, leaving me in the hallway with my heart racing. I walked out of the building, feeling like I was in a fog. My thoughts were jumbled. What did Pearl mean? What inconsistencies had she noticed? And why was she only telling me now? When I reached the parking lot, I saw Leighton Farley standing by his pickup, smoking. When he saw me, he dropped the cigarette and stomped on it with his shoe. "Mercy!" he called out. "Wait a minute." I stopped, not sure I was ready for another conversation. But Leighton had always been good to me, and I couldn't just walk away. "I'm sorry about what happened inside," he said, stepping closer. "Dolores, she wasn't always like this. At least not with your father. She just wants to control everything that belonged to my father," I said quietly. "And not just that." Leighton lowered his voice. "At that meeting, they announced they were selling the company." "What?" I couldn't believe my ears. "But Dad never wanted this. He always said Oakley Construction was his legacy, his baby." "I know," Leighton said sadly. I tried to object, but Dolores said the decision had already been made. "They're negotiating with Brickwell Developments. Do you know them?" I shook my head. "It's a big corporation out of Boston. They're buying up small construction companies all over New England. Typical tactics. They come in, squeeze all the juice out of the contracts, lay off the local workers, bring in their cheap crews. What does Pearl say?" He shook his head. "I think you should talk to her yourself. She knows more than any of us." He looked at his watch. "I've got to get back." He turned to go, but I stopped him. "Leighton," I said. "Thank you for sticking up for me inside." He smiled slightly, making the wrinkles around his eyes deepen. "Your father was a good man, Mercy. And you're a lot like him. You should know that." With those words, he walked away, leaving me alone in the parking lot with a lot more questions than I had when I came in. I got into the car, but I didn't start it right away. Thoughts swirled around in my head like fall leaves in the wind. What's going on with Dad's company? What does Pearl know? And most importantly, what can I do about it? After talking to Leighton, I couldn't just sit around. I couldn't stop thinking about what was going on with my dad's company. All the way home, I thought about what Leighton had said, about Pearl's hints, about Wesley and Darla's arrogant faces. I didn't know how to fight. I wasn't used to confronting. But strangely enough, now I wanted to act. The first thing I did was call Pearl. She answered after the second ring, as if she'd been waiting for my call. "Mercedes." I could hear the relief in her voice. "I thought you'd never call again." "I need to know more," I said without preamble. "About the company, about the will, about everything." "Come to my place," she said. Now. Pearl's house was a neat little cottage, with a white picket fence on a quiet street. She opened the door before I could knock. "Come in," she said, glancing outside, as if she was afraid I was being watched. The inside was as neat as the outside. Pearl led me into the living room, where some folders were already on the coffee table. "I've been waiting for you," she said. "After our conversation at the office, I realized we needed to talk. I have something to tell you." Pearl opened one of the folders. Inside were copies of Oakley Construction's financial statements for the last year. "Look!" She pointed to the columns of numbers. "Here and here, large sums were routinely withdrawn into accounts of companies that didn't exist. West Tech Supply, Blue Ridge Consulting, their shell companies registered to Wesley and Darla. They were stealing from my father's company? I couldn't believe how brazen that was." "Exactly," Pearl nodded. "And your father didn't know about it. Or he found out too late." She sighed. "He'd been a lot of things the last year. Out of sorts. Those medications for his back pain." "What kind of medication?" I asked, feeling my insides clench. "Strong opioids," Pearl answered. "Dolores insisted he take them, even though there were alternatives. She said they were the only ones that worked. And your father trusted her." I felt my mouth drying up. As a nurse, I knew the dangers of opioid analgesics, especially when taken for long periods of time. "We need more information," I said firmly. "About the drugs, about the company's finances, about the will." "The will?" Pearl shook her head. "Dolores claims that Jebediah changed it 3 months before he died. But I worked with your father for 35 years, and he never told me about it. And he always consulted me on important financial matters, both company and personal. You think she's lying? I think we need proof, Pearl replied practically. And I know where to find it. She handed me a small key. It's for your father's study. There's a safe behind a painting of a mountain landscape. The code is the day of your first successful fishing trip. I stared at the key in my hand. You want me to? Yes, Pearl nodded. There'll be no one in the office on Sunday except old Joe at the front door. You'll tell him you've come to pick up your father's personal effects. I hesitated. What Pearl was proposing bordered on trespassing. What if I get caught? You're Jebediah's daughter, Pearl shrugged. You have every moral right to be there. Sunday morning, I parked near the Oakley construction office. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it was about to jump out of my chest. I'd never done anything like this before. Never broke the rules. Joe was dozing at the front desk, just as Pearl had predicted. He perked up when I walked in. Mercedes? He wondered. What are you doing here on a Sunday? Hello, Joe, I said, trying to smile as naturally as possible. Dolores asked me to get my father's personal belongings out of his office. They're going to do some renovations. Joe frowned for a moment, but then waved his hand. Come in, of course. You know where your father's office is. Once up on the second floor, I quickly found the right door. My hands trembled as I slid the key into the lock. Inside, the office looked almost exactly as I remembered it, except for a few details. Gone were the family photos that used to stand on the bookshelf. A new computer appeared on the desk. I walked over to the painting of a mountain landscape I'd given my father for his 50th birthday and took it off the wall. Behind it was indeed a small built-in safe. I remembered the code, the day of our fishing trip together, the first time I caught a trout. The safe opened with a quiet click. Inside were several folders, a box of my mom's jewelry, and an envelope marked for Mercy. My heart hammered even harder. I quickly put everything in my bag and put the painting back where it belonged. Now it was time to look around the desk. In the top drawer, I found the usual office supplies. In the second was the current company documents. The bottom one contained a locked wooden box that I remembered. My dad always kept important personal documents there. I tried to open it, but it was impossible without the key. My gaze fell on the new computer. Maybe there was something important in there? I turned it on, but the system asked for a login and password. Suddenly, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone was approaching the office. I quickly shut down the computer and hid behind the door. The footsteps stopped right at the entrance. Then the doorknob turned. Strange. I was sure I'd locked it, Joe muttered, peering inside. I held my breath. Joe looked around, but didn't see me behind the door. Mercedes, he called out. Are you in here? When he didn't get an answer, he shrugged and left, closing the door. I took a breath and decided it was time to leave. Gathering my bag, I peered cautiously out into the hallway, empty, and hurried toward the exit. Did you find anything interesting? Joe asked as I passed the counter. Just some pictures and souvenirs, I lied. Thanks, Joe. At home, I spread the documents I'd found on the kitchen table. The first folder contained the original contract documents for the renovation of the old part of town, the same multi-million-dollar project Leighton had mentioned. The second was even more interesting. It contained a draft will dated just 6 months earlier. According to this document, Dad left the company to me and Dolores, with the stipulation that it could not be sold without my consent. There was also a trust fund clause for employees who had been with the company for more than 10 years. This was completely contrary to what Dolores had said about the revised will. But the draft wasn't signed. Was it finalized? And if so, where was the original? I opened the envelope labeled, "For Mercy." Inside was a short note from Dad. Mercy, if you're reading this, it means I didn't get it right in time. Forgive me for being weak and letting them influence my decisions. If possible, talk to Garrett about the will dated May 15th. It's my attempt to make things right and apologize. And be careful with Dolores. She's not who I thought she was. Love you, Daddy. The note was dated the 1st of July, 3 months before he died. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean, didn't have time to make things right? And what exactly had Dad learned about Dolores? The next step was to look into Dad's medical records. I knew it was unethical, perhaps even illegal, but I needed answers. The next day, I took the next day off and drove to the hospital where Dad was being treated. Using my status as a nurse and my knowledge of the system, I was able to access his complete medical history. What I discovered stunned me. Dad's condition had deteriorated dramatically over the past year. His primary care physician, Dr. Richardson, had changed his treatment regimen twice, reducing the dose of oxycodone because of possible cardiac complications. At each subsequent visit, however, Dad reported that he continued to take the same dose because, otherwise, the pain is unbearable. In the last entry, made 2 weeks before Dad's death, Dr. Richardson directly expressed his concern. Patient insists on increasing oxycodone dosage against my recommendations. Explained the risks of cardiac complications. Patient states that his wife is monitoring his medication. Attempted to speak with her, but she did not show up for her appointment. Strongly recommend dose reduction and cardiac evaluation. Had this examination been performed? I flipped through the records further, but found nothing. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot, trying to make sense of everything I had learned. As a nurse, I understood the dangers of high doses of oxycodone, especially for a patient with heart problems. And I knew that Dolores, despite all her claims of caring, was ignoring the doctor's recommendations to lower the dose. Could she have intentionally kept the dosage high, knowing the risks, or even increase it? The thought was so horrifying that I didn't want to believe it, but the facts spoke for themselves. I called my colleague Sarah, who worked in cardiology. "Sarah, I'm sorry to bother you," I began when she answered. "I have a professional question. Can prolonged use of high-dose oxycodone trigger a heart attack?" "In a patient with existing cardiac problems, definitely," she replied, "especially if there are unrecorded interactions with other drugs." "What happened?" "Just wondering," I lied. "Thanks, Sarah." I hung up the phone and stared at my father's medical records. The list of medications he was taking included digoxin, a heart medication, in addition to oxycodone. And under allergies, it was clearly labeled hypersensitivity to opioid analgesics. Something didn't add up. If Dad was hypersensitive to opioids, why was he prescribed oxycodone at such a high dose? And why didn't Dr. Richardson insist on changing the medication, knowing about the sensitivity? I remembered how Dolores always insisted on giving Daddy his medication personally. "Jebediah has been so absent-minded lately, he might forget or mix up the dose," she used to say with a caring smile. The thought that Dolores might have intentionally manipulated Dad's medication, knowing the possible consequences, made me nauseous. But everything pointed that way. I had to talk to Dr. Richardson, find out why he kept prescribing oxycodone despite the risks, and I had to find the original May 15th will that Dad had written. But first, I had to meet Pearl and show her what I'd found. She could help me sort through the financial records and see how deep Wesley and Darla's machinations went. On the way to Pearl's, I stopped at a coffee shop to gather my thoughts and grab a bite to eat. 2 men in business suits were sitting at a nearby table. I didn't intend to eavesdrop, but when I heard the name Wesley Huxley, I was alert. "I assure you, Mr. Briggs, Oakley Construction is a great acquisition for Brickwell," one of the men said. Wesley Huxley confirmed that the deal was almost done. Once the will is announced, they will have full control of the company and can finalize the sale. "What about Oakley's daughter?" the second man asked. "I'd heard that the original will gave her a large share." Huxley assured me that that wasn't a problem. The new will excludes her completely. And, he said, they had ways to convince her not to contest it in court. I felt the blood run cold in my veins. Ways to convince me? What does that mean? I quickly paid and left before the men noticed me. I sat in the car for a few minutes, trying to calm the trembling in my hands. This was getting even more serious than I thought. When I arrived at Pearl's house, I spread out all the documents I had found on her kitchen table. She scrutinized them, especially the medical records. "This is very serious, Mercedes," she said finally. "If what we suspect is true, Dolores may be involved in your father's death." "Do you think she deliberately gave him the wrong doses of medication?" I asked, still not wanting to believe that possibility. "I don't know," Pearl answered honestly, "but I do know that Wesley and Darla are stealing from the company, and that they're in a hurry to sell the business before anyone finds out." I spent the next few days gathering information bit by bit. Each new fact, each document became a piece of the puzzle that gradually added up to a frightening picture. After talking to Pearl, I decided to talk to my father's former coworkers who had been laid off in recent months. First on my list was Gina Collins, the chief accountant who had been with the company for 15 years. "I knew something was wrong," she said as she escorted me into the living room of her tidy home. "Your father would never have approved of what was going on at the company." Gina also told me about the strange payments she'd noticed shortly before she'd been laid off, large sums of money being transferred to company accounts she'd never heard of. "Did you talk to Dad about it?" "I tried," Gina sighed, "but by then he was not quite himself. Those pain meds were taking their toll on him. And when I insisted on seeing him, Dolores intervened, said I was bothering him for nothing." Gina pulled a folder out of her desk drawer with copies of documents she'd made before she quit. They clearly showed suspicious transactions to dummy company accounts. "There's over $2 million here," she said, pointing to the total. Money that had simply disappeared from the company in 6 months. After Gina, I met with Marcus Tanner, the former business development manager, a tall African-American man with a wide smile. He remembered me as a kid. "Something strange has been going on in the company over the last few months." He confirmed my suspicions. New contracts were being awarded to firms no one had ever heard of. "What about the contract for the reconstruction of the old part of the city?" I asked. Leighton had mentioned it. "That was our golden ticket, Mercedes. Your father worked on that contract for 3 years. $20 million for the first phase, with a possible expansion to 50. We won the bid 2 weeks before I was fired." "And what happened after that?" "I don't know for sure, but I heard from former coworkers that Wesley started negotiating the sale of the company as soon as the tender results were announced. Which is odd, because that contract was supposed to increase Oakley Construction's value many times over." "Unless you're planning a quick sale and don't show that contract in the assets," I remarked. Marcus nodded. "Sell the company, and then through a shell company, get all the benefits of the contract." A classic scheme. My next visit was to Dr. Richardson, my father's primary care physician. I wasn't sure if he would agree to talk to me, but I was lucky. He remembered me and agreed to a brief meeting. "I wanted to ask about my father's treatment in the last months before his death," I said bluntly. "You do realize there is doctor-patient confidentiality." "I'm a nurse, and I've seen my father's medical records. I'm interested in why you continued to prescribe him oxycodone despite his hypersensitivity to opioids and heart problems." Dr. Richardson took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Your father suffered from severe pain. We tried other medications, but he insisted that only oxycodone provided relief. I repeatedly warned him of the risks and tried to lower the dosage, but the chart says he continued to take the same dosage against your advice." "Yes, and that bothered me. I tried to talk to Mrs. Oakley, but she rarely accompanied your father to his appointments. 2 weeks before your father died, I insisted on a cardiologic examination and a reduction in his dosage. But it was too late," I finished quietly. The doctor nodded and gave me the contacts of the cardiologist he'd referred my father to, but he'd never seen. By the end of the week, I had an impressive folder of documents: financial statements from Gina, notes from Marcus about the remodeling contract, my father's medical records, a copy of the draft will from his safe. All of these indicated that Dolores and her children weren't just stealing from the company, but might have been involved in Dad's deteriorating condition. I needed legal advice. Pearl recommended Evelyn Keener, a probate attorney from a neighboring town. "She's tough and honest, and she's not afraid to take on tough cases." Evelyn turned out to be a short, full woman with short gray hair and a piercing gaze. She listened carefully to my story and examined the documents. "The financial fraud is pretty obvious," she said. "These shell companies, the transfers of large sums of money, all of that can be proven in court. But as for the manipulation of the will, it's more complicated." "What do you mean?" "To contest a will, we need to prove that your father was incapacitated at the time he changed it or was under undue influence. Medical records might help, but Dolores will probably argue that your father was sane." "What about the note he left me? Does it mention a will dated May 15th? It's a crucial piece of evidence, but we need the original will, or at least confirmation from Garrett Montgomery that it exists." "Do you think he'll cooperate?" Evelyn thought for a moment. Lawyers usually keep copies of all their clients' documents. If the will really exists, Garrett should have a copy. The question is whether he'll give it to you. And if he doesn't, then we can file a formal request through the court. But that would take time, and Dolores could sell the company before we get the documents. I could feel my hope starting to fade. So what do I do? First, we need to stop the sale of the company. I'll prepare a preliminary injunction against the sale of Oakley Construction's assets until the probate dispute is resolved. But to do that, we need hard evidence that there is a disputed will. I have a draft and a note from my father. That may not be enough. We need something more substantial, maybe a witness who has seen the original will or knows of its contents. I thought about it, and then I remembered. Garrett's secretary. The day I went to the probate meeting and Dolores kicked me out, the secretary was there. She was checking the guest list. "Great!" Evelyn perked up. If she works with documents, she might have seen the original will. Try talking to her off the record. We agreed that Evelyn would start preparing the paperwork for the injunction, and I would try to find more evidence that the original will existed. On my way out of the office, I called Leighton Farley. "Leighton, it's Mercedes. I need your help." What's up?" "I'm gathering evidence against Dolores and her children. Financial fraud, manipulation of the will. But I need more information about the contract for the Old Town redevelopment." "Why this contract?" "Because it's worth tens of millions, and Dolores is in a rush to sell the company before the money hits the Oakley construction accounts." "I'll try to get the documents," Leighton promised. "But be careful, Mercy. Wesley and Darla are not people to mess with." "I know, but I'm not going to keep quiet anymore and let them destroy what Dad built." At home, I spread out all the documents on the kitchen table, trying to organize the information. Everything pointed to an elaborate scheme to seize control of my father's company and its assets. But was Dolores capable of more? Could she have deliberately hastened Dad's death by manipulating his medications? The thought was so horrifying that I didn't want to believe it. But the facts spoke for themselves. I remembered Dad, his smile, his pride in the company he'd built. "This is my legacy, Mercy," he often said. "Something that will be left behind for me." I couldn't let Dolores and her children destroy that legacy for their own gain. The next morning, I went to Garrett Montgomery's office. When I walked in, the receptionist, the same young woman who'd been in the meeting, lifted a surprised look at me. "Ms. Oakley, do you have an appointment?" "No," I replied. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you, Ms. Parker. Emma Parker." She looked puzzled. "Me?" "Yes. It's about my father's will, the will of May the 15th. Her face changed for a moment. Was it surprise? Recognition? But she quickly pulled herself together. "I'm sorry, but I can't discuss client files. It's confidential information." "I understand," I nodded. "But this is about justice. It's about my father's last will and testament, which may have been tampered with. I just want to know the truth." Emma hesitated. She looked at Garrett's office door, closed, then back at me. "I'm really sorry," she said quietly. "But I can't help you. I have a non-disclosure contract, and I could lose my job." I saw sympathy in her eyes, but also fear. Well, that was a long shot. "I understand," I said, pulling out my business card. "If you change your mind, here's my number." As I walked out of the office, I felt disappointed, but not desperate. This was only the first step in my plan. I still had other options. That evening, Leighton called. He had gotten the paperwork for the remodeling contract, a complete copy, including amounts and payment schedules. We agreed to meet the next day so he could give them to me. Little by little, the pieces of the puzzle came together. With each new document, each conversation, I became more and more convinced that Dolores and her children had been planning this for a long time, taking control of their father's company, withdrawing money, selling the business, and maybe even his untimely death. The day of the reading of the will was overcast. Low clouds hung over Rutland, promising rain, but so far only threatening it. I stood in front of the mirror in the hallway, assessing my appearance. Dark blue suit, minimal makeup, my hair in a neat bun. I looked serious and collected, not the soft, pliant Mercedes that everyone was used to seeing. Next to me on the table was a leather folder with documents, the result of a week of intensive work. Financial statements, testimonials from former employees, her father's medical records, a draft of the original will, and, most importantly, confirmation of the machinations of the Old Town redevelopment contract. Evelyn Keener, my attorney, called the night before. "It's all set, Mercedes," she said. "The injunction against the sale of the company has been prepared. As soon as there's evidence of manipulation of the will, we'll file it." I thanked her and hung up, feeling strangely calm. For the first time in a long time, I knew exactly what I was doing. The final touch was a call from Garrett Montgomery's secretary, Emma Parker. She called late at night, just as I was getting ready for bed. "Ms. Oakley?" Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "It's Emma from Mr. Montgomery's office." "Yes, Emma. Thank you for calling." "I can't talk long, but, the will is dated May 15th. It exists. I've seen it. Mr. Montgomery keeps a copy in the safe." My heart quickened. "Are you sure?" "I'm positive. I typed it and witnessed the signing. Your father was of sound mind when he signed it. And the other thing is," she hesitated, "there was another will, a more recent one. It revoked the first one. But what? I think there's something wrong with it. The signature looks, strange. The signature was a little different. Also, the day it was signed, your father seemed very distracted. I'm not sure he knew what he was signing. Emma, would you testify to that officially? In court?" Long pause. "Yeah, I don't know. I need this job. But what Mrs. Oakley is doing, it's wrong. Think about it," I said softly. "And thank you." Now, standing in front of the mirror, I mentally went over my plan. The meeting was set for 10 o'clock in Garrett Montgomery's office. Dolores had undoubtedly invited all of the company's key employees and business partners to publicly cement her triumph. Well, she was in for a surprise today. At 9:30, I pulled up to the lawyer's office. Several cars were already parked in the parking lot, including Dolores's black Mercedes. I took a deep breath, grabbed my file, and got out of the car. At that moment, a minivan pulled up to the building, and 3 men in business suits got out. One of them waved at me. "Ms. Oakley?" the tall, gray-haired man asked, extending his hand. "Randall Porter, Norton Construction." I shook his hand. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Porter. After what you told us about the attempts to reroute the contract, we just had to come." He nodded to his companions. "This is Howard Green, our CFO, and Terrence Moore, the company lawyer." We entered the building together. Garrett's secretary, not Emma, but some other girl, ushered us into a large conference room. About 15 people were already gathered there. I recognized Leighton Farley, Vincent Quinlan, a few of my father's other employees. Dolores was sitting at the head of the table, with Wesley and Darla on either side of her. They were talking quietly about something. When I walked in with the Norton Construction representatives, the chatter died down. Dolores raised her eyebrows, a look of surprise on her face that quickly changed to annoyance. "Mercedes," she said with a fake smile. "How nice of you to join us." Although I must admit, I'm surprised, given the circumstances. I didn't answer, just nodded and sat down in the empty seat at the far end of the table. Mr. Porter and his colleagues were seated next to me. "Who's that?" Wesley asked, pointing at the men. "Representatives of Norton Construction," Mr. Porter replied, holding out his business card. "The company that won the tender for the reconstruction of the old part of the city." Wesley's face turned visibly pale. He cast a quick glance at his mother, who remained icily calm. "How interesting," she said. "But actually, this is a private meeting for the reading of the will. I don't see what your company has to do with it." "Oh, we'll explain shortly," Porter replied calmly. At that moment, Garrett Montgomery entered with a folder of documents. He was a tall, thin man in his 50s, with balding hair and thin-rimmed glasses. He nodded to the crowd and sat down in his seat. "Good morning, everyone," he began. "We are gathered here to formally announce the last will and testament of Jebediah Lawrence Oakley. Before I begin, I want to express my condolences to the family. Jebediah was a good man and a valued client." He opened a folder and pulled out a document. "This will, dated July 23rd of this year, is the last legally valid will of Jebediah Oakley. It revokes all previous wills." Dolores smiled smugly. I remained calm, though inside I was shrinking with anxiety. Emma had been right. There was a second will that nullified the one Dad had made on May 15th. Garrett began to read the document. As expected, under this will, all of Papa's property, including the house and company, went to the Dolores. Wesley and Darla received substantial sums of money. I was left only some family heirlooms and $10,000, a ridiculously small sum considering the total value of the inheritance. When Garrett finished reading, there was silence in the room. All eyes were on me. Dolores didn't hide her triumphant smile. "Well," she said, turning to me, "I realize this may be a disappointment to you, Mercedes, but it was your father's wish. He thought the company should be run by someone with business acumen. However, I'm sure $10,000 will be a useful addition to your modest nurse's salary." Several people squirmed uncomfortably in their seats. Wesley and Darla exchanged chuckles. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my folder, pulled out the documents, and silently handed them to Garrett Montgomery. He looked at me in surprise, then took the papers and began to look through them. "What is this?" Dolores asked sharply. I remained silent again. Let the papers speak for themselves. Garrett's face grew more and more serious as he looked through the papers. Finally, he looked up. "Mrs. Oakley," he turned to Dolores, "here is evidence of financial fraud at Oakley Construction. Transfers of large sums of money into the accounts of shell companies registered to you, your son, and your daughter." "What is this nonsense?" Wesley exclaimed. "This is some kind of mistake." "There are also testimonies from former employees of the company about systematic withdrawal of funds," Garrett continued, ignoring the exclamation, "and medical records indicating that Jebediah Oakley was under the influence of strong medication in the last months of his life, which could have affected his decision-making ability." "This is absurd!" Dolores jumped to her feet. "Jebediah was completely sane when he made his will." "One last thing." Suddenly, Garrett picked up the last document. A statement from Emma Parker, my secretary, that the signature on the will, dated July 23rd, looks suspiciously different from Jebediah Oakley's usual signature, along with comments about his condition. Complete silence reigned in the room. Dolores's face contorted with rage. "That bitch is lying!" she shouted. "She was just offended that she wasn't in the will. And also," Randall Porter intervened, standing up, "we have evidence that Mrs. Oakley tried to divert the Old Town redevelopment contract to Brickwell Developments, with whom she was negotiating the sale of Oakley Construction. This is a direct violation of the terms of the bid and a potentially criminal act." Dolores stood up abruptly, her face white with rage. "It's all a lie, a setup. You're just jealous that my father left everything to me." I shook my head calmly. "Dad would never have left you everything. He loved his company and cared about the people who worked there. He would never have approved of what you were doing, stealing from the company, planning its sale, firing loyal employees. Garrett! Dolores turned to the lawyer. Tell them! Tell them the will is valid! Garrett Montgomery looked extremely concerned. Given the evidence presented, I am forced to suspend the execution of the will until all the circumstances are clarified. If there is any suspicion of fraud or coercion, we cannot consider this document to be the valid will of Jebediah Oakley. What? Dolores shrieked. You can't do that. We paid you. She faltered, but it was too late. Garrett looked at her with cold surprise. Paid me? What exactly, Mrs. Oakley? Dolores bit her lip, realizing she'd let it slip. Wesley grabbed her arm, trying to silence her. I suggest we take a break, Garrett said, standing up. I need to study these documents more carefully, and perhaps consult with law enforcement. That won't be necessary, came a voice from the doorway. A man in a suit with a badge stood there. Detective Martinez, Economic Crimes. We've been monitoring Brickwell developments for some time now, but a call from Ms. Oakley, the deceased's daughter, was very helpful. I think we have a lot to talk about, Mrs. Oakley. The room began to bustle. Dolores was yelling something. Wesley tried to leave, but was stopped by the detective. Darla was crying. The rest of the people present watched in shock. I sat quietly, feeling neither triumph nor gloating, only relief that the truth had finally come out. After an hour, the situation calmed down a bit. Dolores, Wesley, and Darla left with the detective to testify. Garrett Montgomery announced that he would call a new meeting after a thorough investigation of all the circumstances. Most of the attendees dispersed, leaving only myself, Leighton Farley, and representatives from Norton Construction. What will happen to the company now? Leighton asked. All of us? If the will of May 15th is recognized as valid, I will become part owner of the company, I answered. And the first thing I'll do is make sure that none of the loyal employees lose their jobs. And the remodeling contract? Randall Porter asked. It's still in effect. My father worked on this project for a long time, and I intend to finish it the way he wanted. When everyone left, I was alone in the conference room. I sat staring at the empty table, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. So much had changed in those 2 weeks. And I had changed the most. The door opened, and Dolores walked in. She looked old and tired, but there was still a wicked fire in her eyes. Are you satisfied? She asked sharply. You've ruined everything I've spent years building. You ruined it, Dolores, I said calmly. With your greed, with your machinations. Dad trusted you, and you betrayed him. He never appreciated me, she said bitterly. Always so absorbed in his precious company, his employees. And what about me? I deserved better. Wasn't it enough for you to be his wife, living in his house, using his money? I wanted security, she exclaimed, guaranteed that I wouldn't be left with nothing if he left me like your mother. I shook my head. Dad didn't abandon my mom. She died of cancer. And he loved you, Dolores. He really did. How could you do that to him? Dolores was silent for a moment, then suddenly changed tactics. Her face softened, her voice softer. Look, Mercedes, maybe we can come to a compromise. I admit that I acted, unwise, but we could settle this between us. Split the company, maybe? You get your share, I'll get mine. We could avoid a public scandal, a lawsuit. In the past, I'd have gone along with that kind of persuasion. In the past, I'd look for any way to avoid conflict. But not now. No, Dolores. There will be no compromise. You and your children stole millions from your father's company. You tried to forge his will, and I'm pretty sure you abused his medication, knowing the possible health consequences. You can't prove that, she hissed, instantly losing her pretend softness. Maybe I can't, but I can and will fight for my father's company, for his legacy, for the people who worked for him. And I'm not afraid of you anymore, Dolores. She stared at me for a few seconds, then turned and walked out, slamming the door. I was left alone, feeling strangely calm. There were still a lot of struggles ahead of me: litigation, reorganizing the company, rebuilding my reputation. But I was ready for it. For the first time in my life, I knew exactly what to do and had the courage to do it. I walked out of the building into the beginning rain, but I wasn't cold. There was a fire burning inside me, not of rage or revenge, but of determination and confidence. I was no longer a will-less shadow that everyone ignored. I was Mercedes Oakley, daughter of Jebediah Oakley, and I was ready to stand up for what was rightfully mine, not just material possessions, but my own dignity, my voice, my power.